Well, as we come to the end of this week, I don't think I'm going to make it to the end of the book. In fact, I'll probably have to pick up the last passages where we talk about kissing, and that may be a topic of interest to you, but greeting with a kiss of love, or the holy kiss as Paul referred to it. But today, I think it's going to probably take me a little bit more time because I want to go into some background for you that may help to explain one of the strange statements that Peter makes in this passage. Where in verse 13, he says, "She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark." Now, the question is, what is Babylon? Was Peter in Babylon? I mean, the city of Babylon still existed at this time, not nearly with the glory that it once had, and it was really on the downhill slide. But the simple fact was Peter actually ministering in Babylon. That's quite a ways from Jerusalem, or quite a ways from the Greek cities, or even Rome. And most scholars believe that actually this is really a code for being in Rome. And the reason is because Rome became kind of the Babylon of the New Testament era. It had all of the wealth, the power, the prosperity, the sophistication, and also it had all the corruption and the evil that Babylon had. And so we believe that's the case, but we also believe that because of what we discover in later writings by various church fathers. So first of all, when he says she greets you, is probably referring to the church in Rome. And when he refers to Babylon, as I said, traditional histories tell us that it's referring to the city of Rome. Now, why do we say that? Because we have writers like Ignatius of Antioch, who was a disciple of the Apostle John. He was martyred in 110 AD. But he wrote, as he was on his way to Rome to stand before the emperor, which led later on to his martyrdom, he wrote 7 letters, and we have a couple of them that are still extant. We call them the letters to the Romans. And he wrote in that, he says, "I do not enjoin you as Peter and Paul did. They were apostles. I'm a convict and they were free, but I'm a slave to this very hour." In other words, he associates Peter and Paul with the church in Rome as if they are well familiar with them. And so that's one of the things we look to and say, it seems like he's strongly suggesting that Peter and Paul had been in Rome. We know Paul had, but we have no hard evidence that Peter ever was, contrary to the claims of the Roman church. Then there's a later writing, a guy by the name of Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote a tract called Against Heresies. And he was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of the Apostle John's. So unlike Ignatius, who was an apostle of the Apostle John, John had a disciple by the name of Polycarp, who was also martyred in a most glorious way. And he had a disciple who was Irenaeus. And Irenaeus wrote this in Against Heresies. It says, "Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church." So here again, we have him saying that Peter and Paul laid the foundation of the church of Rome. Well, one of the things we know is there was already a church in Rome, but I'm not sure the foundation was as firm as it needed to be. It wasn't based upon really the full gospel, as we discover that Paul first, and then probably later on that Peter was involved there. And the later histories, by one written by much later by a guy named Eusebius, he states that Peter was crucified in Rome upside down, and that's where that tradition comes from, because he wrote that in his histories of the church. And there are others who spoke about that as well. We have Clement, who was the bishop of Rome in the late 90s AD. Also later 2nd century writers Tertullian and Origen also made mention of Peter being in Rome. So we don't know fast and firm, but in terms of historical verification for somebody who was not recognized at the time as a historical figure, that's pretty strong evidence, pretty strong indication that he actually was in Rome, and that's where he ministered, and that's where eventually he was martyred. which, by the way, I got through that much quicker than I thought I would, brings me to the last verses of the passage where he says, greet one another with a kiss of love. And we automatically begin to go say, I'm not kissing anybody, especially any other guy. Now, it's obvious. I've known guys who, especially when I was a younger day, when we were young Christians, who used to use this as a way of getting girls to kiss them. I questioned their Christianity, and I certainly, even at the time, said, I don't think that's what they mean, although I didn't know enough to tell them that's not what they meant. And it's interesting because the phrasing is a little different, the kiss of love, but the love word here is the word agape, or we call it agape. It's this altruistic love that, it's a love of affection, a love of goodwill, a love of benevolence and brotherly love. It's not a sensual love. And so we're pretty sure that he's not speaking of kissing one another in a sensual way. In fact, we find that 4 times Paul ends his letter to the Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and also 1st Thessalonians. He ends with a similar statement where he says, greet one another with a holy kiss. And here again, the kiss is part of the cultural dynamic because in the Near East, it was very common and still is in many Arab cultures to greet one another with a kiss. Men do it all the time. They kiss each other on the cheek, and they do it in many other countries. So sometimes people are familiar with the French will do this. The Greeks the English would never do it, but the French would do it. And this is all part of the carryover of this ancient custom that was part and parcel of the Mediterranean world at that time. And the idea is that it symbolizes a closeness of love and affection, because you think about it. When Jesus says to Judas, do you betray me with a kiss? That is kind of the lowest kind of betrayal that you possibly can, because a kiss on the cheek is an expression of intimacy and love and brotherhood and care. And here Judas is betraying Jesus, identifying him for death by doing the thing that was often the sign of the greatest of love and affection. You don't kiss an enemy. And I'd say even today in our version of kissing, that it's interesting because those who have studied these things found that couples who kiss each other every day, especially if you can get a 6-second kiss, a 6-second kiss is one that you have to hold for a moment, that they have a much higher chance of surviving maritally than people who don't kiss, who don't show that kind of expression. You can do the 6-second kiss, or they also call the 20-second hug. These acts of affection, coming close and inviting people into your personal space and holding them intimately in that personal space, are the things that bind couples together, bind people together. And that's why one of the things that Peter was simply saying is you need to be seeking to have that intimacy of friendship and love and brotherhood, to see these people as family members. So, when I see my brother, we always hug each other because we love and care for each other. And I do it with people in our congregation all the time. It just seems natural to hug people and show them affection. And let me tell you, this was not something that came to me by nature or even by training. My parents didn't like each other very much, and I rarely saw them ever kiss and rarely ever saw them embracing. And so I grew up with them not really showing me that much affection either. And so when I became a Christian, this was a whole new territory to me. And I was, kind of felt real uncomfortable about the idea of embracing people. But then I thought, wait a minute, this is what God wants me to do. And it's not an amorous hug. There's certainly ways to embrace people that can be very discreet. We often talk about men and women who embrace, and we do the side hugs, But the whole point is that touching of other people is an important part of our self-affirmation and personal inner healing. That when people don't want to touch us and don't want to be around us and don't show us affection and care, there is a certain loneliness that begins to creep into our life. And I think that's the sad thing, is that many people live those kind of solitary and isolated lives. I remember reading a story one time about an elderly man who would go to the barber shop every week to get a haircut. And the barber finally said, your hair doesn't grow fast enough to get a haircut every day, every week. You can come in every 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. It's not so necessary. And the elderly gentleman said to him, I come not because I need a haircut, because this is the only time I'm ever touched by another person. And you think about how incredibly tragic it's a man who's touching you in a professional way to cut your hair. It's not even a touch of intimacy. But this man was so deprived of affection in his life, physical affection, that he had to get a haircut in order to be able to have somebody just touch him. And there's something about that when other people hug us and they love us and they show us affection in that way, that it's an affirming of our worth and our value and our importance. So it's interesting that Peter says in his closing words, he says that if you want the peace of God to be on you, he says, peace to all of you who are in Christ. That peace means that there's not any kind of space between you and the people in your life, that you make sure that there's not a space that builds between you because you make the effort to show affection to them. And again, we live in a world, you know it better than I do probably, that there's a lot of people who just get very little love and affection. And I'm not calling for a hug-a-thon, but I'm just simply saying we just need to be willing to show each other affection. To maybe you're not comfortable with kissing somebody on the cheek. I know I'm not particularly going to do that, but I'm certainly going to give people hugs if it's appropriate. Well, hope you've got some stuff out of this week. And I can't believe we ended the book. And next week we'll start again in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. I'm looking forward to it. Many blessings.